Welcome to Rethink Community Podcast, brought to you by Think Tank, Inc. I'm your host, John White. For the last 10 years, Think Tank has been helping people and organizations step into the stories of those who face poverty every day. We believe that stories have the power to break through our opinions and positions and bring us together. On this podcast, we bring you real stories from real people who have grappled with poverty, faced obstacles, blazed new trails, and forged unlikely relationships.
Have you ever thought you knew something for sure, and then an experience came along and blew up what you thought you knew? In this episode, we flip things around and put our host, John White, on the other side of the microphone to share his journey of politics and personal transformation. My name is Marlo Fox, and I'm the director of Think Tank. Today, I have the great pleasure of reversing roles and interviewing our host, John White. John, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
For most of us, what we know of our elected officials might be limited to a brand, an image, maybe some sound bites or a platform. But there's always a real person behind all of that, and John, you're no exception. You spent 8 years in the Ohio State House, but you've got quite a story behind that most people wouldn't know about. So today we get to talk about some of your story, especially as it relates to how you understand poverty. John, if I could share a little bit about your background. During your term of service in the Ohio House of Representatives, you became chair of the Health Committee and the Criminal Justice Committee, managing dozens of bills affecting the citizens of Ohio's health and human services. In 2003, you authored legislation to establish the Governor's Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, which seeks to mobilize the faith and community-based organizations across Ohio to help solve the toughest social problems that we face. In 2009, you joined our team here at Think Tank, and since that time have been able to take the foundation that you established as a policy leader and see it through at a community level by engaging organizations across the country to fight the root causes of poverty. So, John, it's an honor to work alongside you and to be able to interview you today. Okay, you ready to go?
Sure.
This is the most important question I'm going to ask you in our conversation today.
All right.
You ready? What 3 words would your family use to describe you?
Well, I have 3 daughters, adult daughters, and they would also say that I'm intense and probably even more intense than they would have liked. So they would say intense. I'm a punster, and I guess early on we were goal-driven. That goal-driven intensity probably doesn't. Sometimes it gets irritating to my daughters, but we were goal-driven as a family of kind of pursuing excellence in everything that we touched, and many times we succeeded, and many times we all failed. So that was all part of life. So thanks for that question.
Punster, I'll be looking out for some puns so you can weave those into our conversation today. Yeah, you have a tremendous family. All of them have gone on to serve their community in lots of meaningful ways. And so maybe we'll hear about that a little bit more as we move along. I want to kind of draw you back to your early days of politics when you first decided to run for public office. What motivated you to take that step back in 2000?
Excuse me. Well, I could say that all my motivation was noble. In some cases, it was, but in really deep down inside, I was kind of searching for an identity, searching actually make an impact, and maybe even get my name out. I wanted to, in some cases, wanted to be famous, and I wanted to stand out. I didn't want to be mediocre, and I thought that politics was a way to do that in the community. I'm not really proud of that, but I think, and many politicians, they run for office to be somebody, and rather than to do something significant and noble. So, at least in my early days, it was maybe just to be somebody. To be honest with you.
Well, I appreciate your honesty, and that makes total sense. I'm curious to know, though, going into your first term of service, how long did kind of maybe that ego-driven motivation last, and what started to change for you as you began to serve in that capacity?
Well, I began 5 years of city council in Kettering, and then ran for the state house, and with a little bit more noble intentions. But there was some turning points. Probably 3 years into my service, I began to hang out with people that were in the trenches in the community, that were really close to issues of poverty and, may I say, maybe injustices. And I didn't know a lot about injustices the way I grew up. And I grew up in kind of a middle-class kind of setting, not a lot of diversity. So I began to be exposed and thankful to another part of life and community that I was not exposed to. And thankfully, I was raised by great parents who nurtured in me to be curious about my community. I remember a day when my parents invited over two men. They were a gay couple, and this was back in it was 19 probably the 70s, and that was certainly to invite a gay couple over for dinner was probably taboo, especially for devout Catholic family. But that had a big impact on me. I was probably 11 years old. And so I was kind of inclined to lean into people that were different than me. And so thankfully, I had a level of curiosity of understanding my community better than I had.
So can you talk a little bit more about that? How did this new platform create a venue for you to take that curiosity and learn a little bit more about communities across the state of Ohio? Specifically, can you talk a little bit about, I know you pretty quickly found yourself in some leadership positions, being chair of the Health Committee, Criminal Justice Committee. Certainly, you were impacting the lives of families in poverty and families that, as you mentioned, had dealt with injustices. So at what point did you start to realize you had a lot to learn when it came to poverty? And what did you decide to do about that?
Well, I was a Republican and in the party, and generally the Republican Party did not have a lot of diversity in it. And I mean African American specifically. And so I was kind of challenged to fill an opening. I had a couple of staff people, and I had an opening, and I actually intentionally went out to hire an African American as a staff person, and the entire floor, in fact, the entire caucus, if you will, did not have one person of color. And so that was kind of a challenge for me. I had a background of human resources, and I knew that diversity was important, but I didn't know it was going to be this important. So we hired someone that came from difficult neighborhoods in Cleveland, and she began to open my eyes to her life and how she grew up. And one time, and so we were dabbling in this field, talking about reentry or criminal justice reforms on prisons, and basically folks that I had not been exposed to. And she wrote up a paper, front 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper of front and back of she filled the both sheets, front and back, with names of people that she grew up with that were either in prison, who died before they went, who had passed, those that went to prison, those that came out of prison, those that were in prison currently. I mean, it was, and then she highlighted them. And everything, and about 80% of the names she grew up with were highlighted. And I said, "What happened to the names that were not highlighted?" And she said, "Well, they managed to get out of that neighborhood unscathed, relatively unscathed." And that was a real shock to me, and someone who had not known anyone that had that kind of difficulty, those kind of challenges, who actually even went to prison or was fatally shot in a particular neighborhood. That just didn't cross my mind. I didn't have that kind of what we call trauma today, and she had that kind of trauma. But she was involved in the legislature to combat some of those issues, and also to give light to those that have not been exposed to that were in isolation, like myself. So that started a journey of curiosity for me, and to start peeling back the onion. So we went to our first prison together and started to listen to people that were in prison, and that began a journey for me.
Yes. So could you talk a little bit more about that, John? I know you referenced in particular her story, and you're fortunate enough to have, that encounter, someone on your staff in that way that was willing to share that story and be an advocate alongside you. When you came into a position of leadership in the Criminal Justice Committee, was it normal for you to have folks that had that kind of lived experience testify in front of you? And if not, then what did you have to do, proactively to really become educated, to be able to steward the leadership platform you'd been given?
Well, as a chairman of the Criminal Justice Committee, you would always, or the Health Committee, you would always have people come before you and advocating on behalf of a particular group. These are associations and lobbyists and advocacies of many sorts, but it's a whole different thing to see folks that had raw lived experience come and talk to you about their personal testimony and their life. And so that was, so we went on the road, and we began to be exposed to those that were returning citizens and their families and their children, and hearing their stories. And then we were exposed also went into prisons and saw a completely different thing that you would experience perhaps on television shows about those that were in prison. These are individuals that, by the grace of God, I could have been involved, would actually part of their journey, experience part of their journey. So I heard their stories. I heard the difficulties that they had coming out of a difficult neighborhood, and the challenges that I would never dream that I would have. So it was the personal. It was myself getting into the uncomfortable conversations that it began to change my head, and it then began to change my heart. And once it goes to the heart, then you're kind of grabbed, then you're gripped. Then you begin to see some breakthroughs, some cracks in your veneer, in your facade. And that's when it gets to be uncomfortable, but that's when it becomes very, very good. And you want, and so story after story after story. And then every story was shattering some paradigms or some stereotypes that I had in my own mind of who these folks were and their families. And so the relationships began. And so those relationships is what changed, that my perspective. And of course, that's the stew in which we have change in our communities, change within our congregations and in our churches, change within policy, is when we get close and personal, hear the story, not think that you know it all. In fact, you come to the conclusion, my goodness, you don't know half of it, and almost feeling a sense of poverty because your life just didn't afford you to be in a part of a community that really needed a better leadership at a policy level and better advocacy. I don't know if I answered your question, Marlo.
Yeah. So could you take that a step further? So you just kind of talk about how those personal encounters and how hearing the stories and face to face with folks that were experiencing the challenges of the criminal justice system and the multiple challenges of poverty's oppression on a community and what that meant for you. And then, then you had to take that back, right? And so you referenced, that was paradigm shifting for you. Certainly we all carry biases around based on the lens with which we see the world and our personal experiences. So that was a shift for you. Can you talk a little bit about how those encounters impacted your leadership, potentially in terms of what you put priority on, or even how you carried yourself amongst your peers?
Well, folks were kind of like, what's going on with White? He's visiting all these prisons, probably every prison in the state of Ohio. And he's beginning to write some legislation, and I was beginning to build relationships and friendships with those advocates in the criminal justice field that were fighting for a long, long time to fight to grab onto a leader that finally, began to understand some of these things. And so we saw the system that was broken. And so we brought together those that were advocates, brought together those that had lived experience within the criminal justice field, those of moms and dads and kids, and we started to patch together some legislation, and some legislation that had some systemic injustices that are just not known it's not known widely, even in places of policy and legislators. It's not known. Simple things like criminal collateral sanctions, all the silly barriers we put up within the system to prevent someone from getting back on their feet, prevent someone from returning to their families and their children after they've served their time. And we put up these roadblocks for them to get a second chance or a third chance at life. And so we put together some legislation, and I won't go into some of that, but it was 3 pieces of legislation that were, and we had to convince my other Republican friends who were also in isolation, as I was. But then we began to bring in testimony to convince, persuade those that were on the fence, and powerful stories. I believe in my heart that mostly everyone in the legislature really wants the end. We agree on the ends. We disagree on the means sometimes, but we agree on the ends. We want everyone to flourish. We want all our children to flourish and our parents to flourish. But they need to hear the stories, and so they had an opportunity to do that, and so we were successful, and just in in a small way impact the system. So it's the relationships that you have, and being able to lean into things you don't really know about, and then and then having a direct line into impacting systems just that started with just a relationship. And I think, Marlo, you would agree, that's a recipe for change. That's a recipe for impact. As everyone knows, we live in just a polarized community, our society right now in America, and we have this us and them going, and we remove ourselves from each other as a community, and we go into our tribes, and rarely we have an opportunity to engage and listen and love and understand each other more intimately. We need a whole lot more of that.
Yeah. So along those same lines, and John, I know you very intentionally worked, even in a polarizing environment, which feels increasingly polarizing, across the aisle, right? And so part of that work that you did meant intentionally reaching out to folks that weren't of your party and building some real personal and deep friendships there. As we think about perhaps the widening gap between our leaders and the community, I just want to kind of close on a couple questions that would cause us to just look ahead at what may be coming and some opportunities we have to lean into this way of leadership that you're describing. So I recently read between 90 and 100% of the U.S. Senate and House hold a bachelor degree or higher. At the same time, we know that less than 40% of the American population hold such degrees, and 40% of our workforce is considered low income. As someone that has served in the State House, are those stats concerning to you? And if so, why? And what's our opportunity there?
Well, they are. And you will find that in Congress, United States Congress or Senate, or at a State House level, that having someone serve alongside you that grew up in poverty or grew up in working class, or is a rarity. And if that's a rarity, and we know that there's probably 40% of our community in the country that are may not have $1,000 in savings at any one time for a situation that they would need that $1,000. We have a widening gap, and a gap that continues to kind of bifurcate. And we have leaders in policy positions, influential leaders that have grown up in middle class or wealth or upper class that have been removed. Kind of that, not because of their own intention, perhaps, but they have been removed. And so we have a governing class that is, some call it elite. There's some truths in some of that, but having a personal experience in some of the struggles is not there. So what I had to do, and what other legislators have had to do, is go on the road. You just have to go on the road and listen and go into communities and to intentionally break down those barriers. And you find out that when you do that, especially for someone like me, that my zip code to which I grew up in was really an advantage for me. I had, and then you begin to understand other zip codes, that there's some disadvantages in many of those zip codes that we may not represent, but we need to go those are people too. Those are people that need an advocate. And you also find out those people in difficult zip codes have great resiliency and great assets and great talents and great hearts. And they have many things that those that are in the upper zip codes of wealth don't have. And you begin to realize, gee, we're just one family here trying to make it one day at a time. And so that's, I don't know if I can answered your question a little bit, but that's, I discovered in my life that I had a little bit of poverty in my life. I didn't have financial poverty. I know I had poverty, and I because of poverty, of lack of relationships, or my poverty of ignorance. And even today, I'm not done yet with me. I need to be intentional about not getting so comfortable around the people that I associate with, or the community I'm with. I need to break down those walls and that comfort level, and to make me a better leader, maybe a better father. So that's the kind of principles that Think Tank is trying to advance, of understanding our own, in some case, privilege, but also opportunity to engage people of difference, and we find out that we're not so different after all.
All right. So any last words you want to leave us with? I know we're moving very rapidly into the final days towards election. For those that may be freshmen coming into a new office for the first time, and those that have served a number of years, or others that are listening to this podcast and have a platform of leadership, any last words of wisdom you want to leave and challenge these community leaders with?
Just that there are forces in our country that profit by advancing division and inciting division. They profit. They make money off doing that. And as I'm a Christ follower, I need to recognize what the forces that are coming at me that is creating narratives and stories in my head about those people or this group or this tribe. And we need to be wise as serpents around those things that want to pit us against each other, not bring us together. That's at least what we're dealing with here in our community, trying to stand up to those forces.
Absolutely. Well, John, thank you for joining us today on the other side of the microphone. We appreciate your leadership and your sharing your story today.
Thank you, Marlo. This has been the Rethink Community Podcast, brought to you by Think Tank, Inc., with music by Elijah Hamilton. Don't forget to subscribe to hear upcoming episodes featuring the stories of other courageous individuals we think you should know. And if you're part of an organization that would like to be better equipped to serve people in poverty, be sure to check out the resources we offer, including the Cost of Poverty Experience, or COPE, at thinktank-inc.org/COPE. Join the hundreds of businesses, schools, colleges, churches, and healthcare providers that have used the Cost of Poverty Experience, along with our other suite of tools and coaching to find new ways of thinking and responding to poverty.